Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the keynote lecture of our conference today, Exhibiting Culture, Museums and Indians. My name is Janet Levitt. I am the Dean of the College of Law, and tonight's lecture is the culmination of a conference that really perfectly illustrates and exemplifies why the partnership between the University of Tulsa and the Gilcrease Museum was such a brilliant partnership to enter into. And it really is a partnership that the College of Law is going to run with. And I hope that this is the first conference of many conferences, hopefully an annual conference here at Gilcrease. Throughout the day, brilliant minds and scholars in multiple disciplines that specialize not only in Native American law, but anthropologists and curators, these scholars came together and have taken part in a compelling exploration of issues surrounding the role of museums and the preservation of Native American culture and art and artifacts. We discussed this morning a little bit the difference between art and artifacts. And it seems to me that this debate and this discussion centers around several issues which should really maybe define a discussion for us going forward. Notions of cultural sovereignty, reconciliation, repatriation, responsibility, partnership, and dialogue. And as I said, I really hope that this is the first of many conferences where we discuss these concepts. The University of Tulsa College of Law, and in particular the Native American Law Center, has been really honored to host this event. And this morning, when I opened the conference, I talked about many of the successes of the center through the successes of our students, of our alumni. But so much of the center's success is traced back to our faculty, who work diligently with our students while maintaining a very active role in the scholarly discourse on Native American issues. So I would like to take a moment to acknowledge those faculty members who are the essence of our Native American Law Center. First, our Chapman Chair, Professor Judith Royster, who's in the back of the room. Most of us know Judy's work. I don't think there's a week that goes by where I don't have some conversation with an alumni or an academic who says, "Oh, you're at the University of Tulsa. You must work very closely with Judy Royster," and it's just a pleasure to have her on the faculty. And she has done path-breaking work in Native American law issues, particularly with natural resources. Bill Rice, Bill. Okay. Bill Rice, another member of our faculty, and I remember very clearly sitting in Judge Moore's office, or his chambers, at the Muskogee Creek Nation courthouse, and he basically said there is really only one person who knows Indian gaming law, and who really defines Indian gaming law, and that's Bill Rice, who wrote the book. And so we're so pleased that he's here and worked on this conference and works in our center. Vicki Lemus is right there. Vicki has been seconded just a bit lately to the Dean of Students role, but she works on tribal economic development issues, and her work has been recognized nationally, and she will be going back to teaching full-time in the fall, and is going to be a class on tribal economic development. And then the fourth member of our faculty, who actually just recently left the faculty, but was a real force behind this conference, is Melissa Tatum. who I believe is going to be joining us in a bit this evening, but we want to thank her as well. So let's just do it one more time. This is the force behind this conference in the summer. And we must also take a moment to recognize the leadership that helped put the museum partnership in place, leading to a valuable combination of resources and talents. I am pleased to recognize Dwayne King, the University of Tulsa's Vice President for Museum Affairs and Director of the Gilcrease Museum, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, who will be introducing our speaker. So, Dwayne, thank you so much for lending this venue for this wonderful day. And we are also very indebted to the TU Board of Trustees, whose guidance and wisdom has led us to the historic partnership between the University of Tulsa and the City of Tulsa to manage this museum. I believe that we have one trustee in the audience, but I always hesitate to say that in case I missed someone else. But I believe Ross Swimmer and his wife Margaret. Ross is a outstanding trustee of the university, and we're so glad that they joined us tonight, so thank you very much. And now, to introduce tonight's speaker, please help me welcome Vice President for Museum Affairs, Dwayne King.
Thank you, Dean Levitt. It's good to see all of you here this evening. I join Dean Levitt in welcoming you to this conference and to the Gilcrease Museum. And I should point out before I begin my remarks that the Gilcrease Museum is on Osage land, part of the Osage Reservation. We're very fortunate to have Chief Jim Gray of the Osage Nation with us tonight. Jim, you want to wave? Our gathering underscores TU's commitment to quality dialogue on American Indian law and policy. It also illustrates the role we hope that the Gilcrease Museum will play as a forum for cultural scholarship. We're pleased to take this opportunity to focus on the important issues surrounding Native traditions and cultural property. Our interest in this topic is both philosophical and practical. The collection here at the Gilcrease Museum includes some 300,000 objects, the majority of Native American origin. It is our aim to steward those in a way that advances scholarship, public dialogue, and good relations with all the groups represented. We are especially gratified that our keynote speaker this evening is Kevin Gover. He not only possesses the intensive legal and administrative experience in Indian affairs, but he also occupies one of the most important museum posts in the nation. Kevin is the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, a role that he has held since December 2007. His responsibilities include oversight of the National Museum of the American Indian on the Smithsonian Mall, of the George Gustav High Center in Lower Manhattan, and the extensive archives of the Cultural Resource Center in Suitland, Maryland. Kevin is a native Oklahoman and a member of the Pawnee and Comanche tribes. He completed his undergraduate work in public and international affairs at Princeton University and earned his law degree from the University of New Mexico. Before taking his current position, he served as professor of law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University in Tempe. There he taught courses in federal Indian law, administrative law, statutory interpretation, and an undergraduate course in American Indian policy. From 1997 until 2000, Kevin served as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs in the U.S. Department of Interior. There he oversaw the Bureau of Indian Affairs and a broad range of programs in education, social services, and treaty rights and other areas. During his early career, he practiced law in Washington, D.C. and in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His practice areas included federal Indian law, commercial transactions, environmental law, and legislative affairs. Today, he serves as Associate Judge of the Tonto Apache Tribal Court of Appeals and on the San Carlos Apache Tribal Court of Appeals. He is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the nonprofit Grand Canyon Trust in Flagstaff, Arizona, and of the Board of Directors of the nonprofit Futures for Children in Albuquerque. I'm sure you agree that we could not have chosen a more qualified person to deliver our keynote message this evening. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Gover.
Thank you, Dwayne, and good evening to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Gilcrease, and especially to be here with Dwayne, who has worked for the National Museum of the American Indian on two separate occasions. The last time he came on board shortly after I did and left very shortly after that. And I thought, is it me? But now I see what a good deal he has here at the Gilcrease, and I'm glad to see him doing so well. Also want to thank Dean Levitt for that kind introduction as well. The National Museum, how many of you have been to the National Museum in the Mall in Washington? Okay, about half. How many of you have been to the museum in New York? I think those were the same hands, weren't they? Okay. Well, the National Museum of the American Indian was established by an act of Congress in 1989. So this is actually the museum's 20th year. And in those 20 years, the museum has a number of outstanding accomplishments, and none of which I can take any credit for. The first was the opening of the George Gustav High Center in New York, which took place 15 years ago, as it happens. The second was the opening of the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland, where the collection is stored, and that took place 10 years ago. And it just so happens that the Mall Museum opened 5 years ago in September. So we have a great deal to celebrate this year at the National Museum. One of the things that we've been working on at the museum is to sort of refresh the entry experience for the visitors at the Mall Museum. As you know, it's a very dramatic space, very high ceiling, rotunda, and not much else, actually. And so we wanted to create an exhibit as the visitor enters, which sort of introduces the museum to the visitor. Our museum is fairly high concept. It's not obvious just how it is you're supposed to enter the museum and enjoy it and where the exhibits are and all of that. So we wanted to do something right at the beginning to sort of guide the visitor into the galleries that we want, in the sequence that we want, in order to help their understanding. But one of the things, so we've installed this new exhibit along the rampway, and as you enter the museum, and there is a quote on each of the stations as you enter. We have, of course, an object or two on display. We'll have something to provide a little context about the significance of the object, but then we'll also quote a native writer or a native historical figure or someone who's had something insightful to say on the subject of the particular item in the exhibit. One of my favorite quotes, and one that I find very touching, is Dr. Iban Wagwa, who is a Kuma Indian from Panama. The Kuma are in Panama and Colombia. And he says, "Out of the Indian silence, I reclaim my name." And I remember the first time I saw that quote, it really touched me in a way that surprised me. And so I began to wonder just what that was about. First, this whole business of name is a very interesting one as we began to tease it out a little. So, for example, I wondered if he were talking about his tribe and how so many of the tribes now are commonly referred to by names other than what they would call themselves. The Comanches, for example, aren't Comanches to them. They're Nermina. Many other tribes are commonly called by the government, by the world, by a name that they did not choose for themselves. It was chosen for them by an enemy tribe, by some distant observer, or by the United States government. And so this idea of reclaiming that name and getting the world to accept the tribe by the name that it has chosen for itself struck me as a powerful concept. Similarly, our individual names as individual people very often have been put onto us in a way that was less than voluntary. And so, for example, my name is Gover. Well, Gover is not a Pawnee name. It's not a Comanche name. It was gotten in some other way. Now, it doesn't, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it, but it is representative of a phenomenon where, as Indians engaged the government and entered into the reservations and began to be enrolled or registered for any variety of purposes, quite often, in fact, almost every time, the reservation agent would give them a name other than the one that they had been given by their family. And so anytime you hear an English name or an Indian name like Running Water, well, that wasn't really their name. That's somebody's translation of their name. And there are some famous examples of how a translation really abuses the meaning of a name. For example, there's a Lakota family, or I think maybe it's a Crow family, called Afraid of His Horses. Well, that makes it sound like the individual is afraid of his own horses. But in fact, what it meant is he was such a fearsome fighter that the enemy was afraid of his horses. And so again, we have to assert our right to say what our name is. Many of us, even with English names, of course, also have a tribal name that's been given to us. We may or may not want that to be known. But again, it's about just the simple right to say who you are. Above all, though, what I understood Dr. Wagwa's quote to mean is name as in your identity. In his case, who he is as part of a Native community. And this claim of identity, the act of self-definition, of saying, this is who I am, this is who my people are, and having that definition accepted as authoritative would seem to be a fundamental right of any people. And yet, more than any other people I can think of in the world today, Indians go through life being defined by others. We are defined by outsiders in a variety of different ways. And this is particularly so in what I call the American myth. And that's not an insulting term to my ear. Myths are stories we tell about ourselves. And the story that America tells about itself traditionally has had Indians as bit players, variously comic or tragic, depending on the particular story being told. But one of the most devastating elements of the American myth is the idea that prior to the arrival of Europeans, America was a vast wilderness. And yes, it was true, there were a few, in the words of the day, nomadic savages ranging around, picking berries, hunting deer, thinking very simple thoughts. But it just wouldn't do in the American myth for these predecessors, these people who were here when the Europeans arrived, to be, for example, studying the stars, or practicing the medical arts, or creating new varieties of crops. And it certainly wouldn't be acceptable to think of them as feeding the world. It's not acceptable to think of them as having created literature, of building cities and monuments, of creating law, or of managing their environment, because all of that contradicts the idea of America as a great wilderness. So what's left for us as Indians? What does this mythology really say about us? Well, it says, among other things, of course, that we weren't using all of this in an effective way, in a way that others were obliged to respect. We weren't populating the land. We weren't working the land in the way that Europeans understood to be best. And when you put all of that together, when you really think about what underlies these ideas about what Indians were doing prior to the arrival of Europeans, it is very clear that the intent of this part of the myth is to say that Indians are inferior culturally, economically, politically, and most distressing of all, intellectually. More troubling still, these misconceptions are not accidental. They are deliberate and they have specific purposes. The most obvious is to validate the stealing of Indian property. And yet, the myth also is used to justify the destruction of native art, language, religion, and even identity. Literally, the right to say who we are. The myth is used to dismiss as a necessary tragedy the murder of individual Indians, the massacre of whole communities, and the genocide of entire peoples. It was at critical moments, first in Europe's and later in America's intellect, that first Europe's and later America's intellectual leaders perpetrated this misinformation campaign. And sad to say, it was the universities, the museums, the sciences that labored mightily to prove that African, Native American, and Asian people were literally inferior. This whole idea of race science is really the roots of anthropology in the 19th century was clearly there, was clearly created to justify the enslavement of Africans, the decimation of Native Americans, and the exclusion of Asians or their exploitation by America and European powers. Now, this so-called science was obviously created not as independent inquiry, not as some sort of true investigation, but rather to support the policies of the day that were being pursued. Now, that creates some special problems for us as Native Americans when we begin to move into these institutions that have been used so effectively to disenfranchise, disempower Native communities in the past. The academy and the museum world have a lot to answer for in Indian country. Now, it's also very fair to say that at this point in history, the scholarly world has changed its ways, at least begun to change its ways. And while it may have happened at a snail's pace, it has changed. But its prior work continues to dominate the narrative that is presented to the American public, and worse, to American children. Thinking of my own experience, here's the first thing I was taught about American history. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He sailed and sailed and sailed and sailed. You're lucky I'm not singing this to you. He sailed and sailed and sailed and sailed to find this land for me and you. Now, I was aware even as a child that I was an Indian and that Indians were here first. So how was it that Columbus had sailed to find this land for me? My confusion deepened when I was required to learn songs in praise of the Pilgrims, and to wear, alternatively, a construction paper pilgrim hat, complete with a yellow buckle on the front, or a construction paper headband with construction paper feathers. My Indian ensemble was accessorized with a tom-tom made of Quaker Oats boxes. This was in Lawton. My ethnic confoundment was complete when, as sixth graders, my Filipino classmate and I were cast as the leading men in our class play, Loco Burrito. the story of Mexican children and their misadventures in a sleepy village in Old Mexico. There were no tryouts for these parts. We were selected because our brown skin lent a certain authenticity to our Mexican characters. I also grew up watching Western movies from the 50s on Saturday afternoons. Now, we've come a long way since Kirk Douglas played an Apache, Sal Mineo played a Cheyenne, so did Ricardo Montalban. Custer was a good guy in those days, at least as played by Errol Flynn, I believe. The Indians, of course, were hapless and tragic and unable to comprehend what was happening to them, and responded with either savage violence or pained dignity, depending on whether any particular screenplay deemed them perpetrators or victims. Now again, we have come a long way since the old Westerns. For one thing, at some point in the 1970s, Custer became a bad guy who got what he deserved. Also, Indians are sometimes allowed to have a sense of humor. And they are even showing up on as television detectives in Oklahoma City and New York. Indians are even allowed to have histories that continue after the 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, such as the Navajo Code Talkers in the movie Wind Talkers. Still, there is some pretty strange stuff out there. A few months ago, some people from Disney's, diversity office or something, came to the National Museum of the American Indian in order to look at our collection, talk with our curators, and so that they could, at Disney, produce programming that was more sensitive to Native cultures and more authentic. This was on a Friday afternoon. I remember it well, because the next night, Saturday night, in prime time on ABC, they showed the movie Peter Pan, in which the chief character in the movie at one point tells Peter Pan, "If no bring 'em windy, burn 'em at stake." So, obviously, the sensitivity session didn't take with Disney. But of course, to me, it was really quite extraordinary that in 2008 they would even consider putting that sort of thing on their air. And the irony obviously never occurred to them that there was something wrong with portraying anybody in that sort of fashion, but particularly Indians. The media has produced, this popular media has produced certain images of Indians that are really very difficult to escape. For example, there's the warrior meme. Now, this meme really underlies the whole mascot culture, and the idea that Indians, if they were football players as opposed to warriors, they would be really good football players because they're so determined and noble and brave and all of those things. I was a mediocre football player, by the way. But the other thing underlying this idea of the warrior is, why is it that our soldiers are responding to a warrior tradition as opposed to a patriot tradition? Why is it that our soldiers are characterized in that fashion as warriors as opposed to patriots? Because what I see, what I hear when I talk to them, is them talking about patriotism, not about a warrior tradition. And yet, this warrior theme is played out over and over in the popular media. Earlier today, we had one of the speakers talking about Magua, the character in Last of the Mohicans. The character, by the way, this is a standing joke in my family, the character played by Wes Studi in Dances with Wolves was called the toughest Pawnee. And that was literally, if you watch the credits one day, Wes Studi, the toughest Pawnee. And then, of course, the ever-reliable Geronimo. And we're about due for another Geronimo movie. Well, we just had one, didn't we? Just a few ago on PBS. Every 10 years or so, you got to have a Geronimo movie. The next image that people derive from all of this is what I've come to call the magic Indian. And I say that with apologies to Spike Lee, because he pointed out a recurring theme in movies not by black people, not by a black director like himself, for example, that he referred to as the magic Negro. And what he was talking about were characters like the guy in the movie about the golfer. What was it called? Bagger Vance, The Legend of Bagger Vance. Bagger Vance was a magic Negro. Or the fellow, the big man who was on death row in The Green Mile and had these curing powers. So that's the magic Negro. Well, we have the same thing. We have the magic Indian. And I remember when I was younger, there was a mini-series called The Mystic Warrior. How many of you remember Hanta Yo? Not that many. That's really good because it was really dreadful. Talk like this, the Indians did. That's why I called it Hanta Yoda. The wise old Indian, of course, shows up consistently in different movies when a caricature is required. But it continues even today. This is a new one on me. I'm an old guy. My kids are grown up, so I don't have to watch what they watch anymore. But apparently there's some phenomenon out there called Twilight that involves vampires, young vampires, and as it happens, some young werewolves who happen to be these incredibly good-looking Indian boys. And they're said to be in the literature and in the movies to be Quileute Indians. Well, okay, everybody's eligible for that kind of treatment, I suppose. I don't know why it had to be Quileutes or even Indians, but there you go. It's the magic Indian again. And the werewolves seem to have a knack for showing up in the very nick of time to save the good vampires from the bad and that sort of thing. So, the magic Indian meme. Next is, and we talked about this earlier today as well, the environmental Indian, that every Indian is a profound environmentalist with nothing but the greatest of respect for all elements of nature. But we know that, first of all, Indians did not just leave nature be. Indians were very active in manipulating the environment and using it effectively for their advantage. So there's some, overstatement in the whole idea. We also know that the great environmentalist Chief Seattle, it turns out he wasn't a fraud, but somebody was, because they put words in his mouth that he never spoke. And yet it's supposed to be one of the great pieces of environmental philosophy ever uttered. And then, of course, where this all comes from in the end is from the wonderful Iron Eyes Cody, who was the man behind the Keep America Beautiful campaign, who would overlook a river with trash in it and a single tear would roll down his cheek. That's the environmental Indian, every bit as much a stereotype as the warrior or the magic Indian. And then finally, there's the noble savage. And this is the defeated Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. This is the character played by Ricardo Montalban in Cheyenne Autumn, when they were finally captured and forced to return to Oklahoma instead of where they wanted to be in Montana. This is also, by the way, the character in the famous sculpture End of the Trail, with the Indian slumped over his horse, clearly defeated, an image that is intended to convey the end of the race. And given the time that it was created in the early 20th century, it was the way America viewed Indians. It was the end of the trail, and Indians would not be around much longer. Now, what's the problem with these images? Aside from the stereotyping and imposing expectations on me as that I need to be a warrior, environmentalist, magic, savage, the greater problem is that it fails to convey the reality of who even these most famous historical characters were. Again, in grade school, who's the Indian you all learned about during Thanksgiving week? Squanto, of course. And what did Squanto do? He taught the Pilgrims to grow corn. Anything else you know about Squanto? Good. I didn't, yeah.
Well, he was a world traveler.
He was indeed.
He was multi-master in many languages. He was a member of a group that was wiped out.
We didn't learn any of that during Thanksgiving week in grade school. His real name was Tisquantum. He was kidnapped in 1605 by an English captain named George Weymouth. This is before the Plymouth colony was established. He returned to North America. He was returned to North America in 1612 by none other than Captain John Smith of Jamestown fame and Pocahontas and all that stuff. Unfortunately, this guy had the worst luck ever. He was kidnapped again in 1614 by Captain Thomas Hunt, who took him to Spain and intended to sell him as a slave. Fortunately, he was rescued by friars. He eventually returned he made his way to London. How would you do that, being an Indian guy in Europe in the 17th century? But he did it. He made his way to London, spent several years there as an apprentice in some shop to earn the money to be able to go home, obviously learned to speak English, returned to New England in 1619, only to find that the coastal tribes of New England, including his own, had been devastated by a plague. So when the Pilgrims saw this Indian and were stunned to learn that this Indian could speak English, there was a whole history to that none of us has ever been told. Similarly, Pocahontas, whose adult name was Matuaka, she was the daughter of, and I can't pronounce this right, but it's Wahunsinaka, or popularly known as Powhatan. You see again how names are created that aren't the names that they called themselves. These are names that others called them. And yet the only name we know is the name that was not their own. After she, of course, who knows if she actually saved John Smith or not. It's sort of lost to history. But after she married John Rolfe, she was known as Rebecca Rolfe, and went to England in 1816. She died in England in 1817 of smallpox. That part of the story didn't show up in the Disney cartoon about Pocahontas. What's tragic about this, and what makes it so destructive, is again, it makes these very real people one-dimensional, when in fact the story, their personal story, and the story of the interaction between Indians and Europeans is very complex. It's very rich. And to tell the whole truth, to my mind, renders the story no less inspiring. It makes it even more so. The sheer unlikelihood of these various factors coming together in the way they did to make it possible, for example, for the Plymouth colony to survive. But it's complex, and when you're working with myth, complexity is discouraged. But it's because of our refusal to deal with complexity that one of my curators, Paul Chott Smith, has written a book titled "Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong." And he means, doesn't mean you, he means us. Everything we know about Indians is wrong. And as he would say, not everything, just almost everything. But it's really true, because of what we're taught in mainstream education, we don't know. We have to go find this material in order to really understand not just Native American history, but the history of the United States. But here's the thing. The things that I was taught that were wrong pale in significance to what I was not taught at all. And I am a classically educated person. You know, I went to public school, went to junior high, went to one of the best prep schools in the United States, went to Princeton University, and yet I didn't know much of what I really ought to have known about Native Americans. For example, the city at the place we now call Cahokia was a city of 40 to 50,000 people in about 1000 AD. It had grid streets, public facilities, monuments, urban renewal projects. This city was larger than the city of London was at the same time, and yet we're not taught about it. The whole Mississippian mound culture throughout the Midwest and Southeast was built of towns, stores of food, elaborate ritual life, extraordinary engineering. Imagine building mounds with dirt that survive to this day. It's not accident. It was engineered to survive. Very high levels of artistic achievement, strong social and political organization. All of these things were true in these mound cultures, and yet we're never taught about those. The Chaco culture of New Mexico was another very elaborate civilization. The elaborate longhouse civilizations of the Northeast and Northwest. And that still leaves us with the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec, and their predecessors, who very clearly had astronomers, mathematicians, very, very advanced mathematicians. In fact, some of their math was more advanced than any in the world. Engineers, philosophers, soil scientists. The Mayas used the same plots of land for thousands of years to grow crops, and it never wore out because they knew how to replenish the soil. The agricultural adaptation, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, any number of other crops were developed by the Indians, were bred by the Indians. They can't figure out how they learned to make corn because it's so different from any other plant that exists or existed in the past. And so clearly it was a hybrid created by the Indians, but they can't figure out what the original root plant was that allowed them to hybridize the plant. Again, by treating Indians in this fashion, by not admitting the advanced civilizations that Indians did create, allowed them to say to themselves, as history moves forward, that these Indians, as we see them now before us, right up to this day, really don't have much of a past. Again, they were hunter-gatherers. It's not that this information doesn't exist. It does. And here, I think the Academy, and archaeology and anthropology in particular, have redeemed themselves with their recent discoveries and the good work that's being done in these fields to show just how rich life was in the Americas prior to contact. But someone, somewhere, is deciding that this material is not important to American students. It's not important for American students to know these things as a routine, as a basic part of the education that they receive in our schools. Why aren't we told this? My dark nature suggests that it's because it explodes the myth of Native cultural and intellectual inferiority. And once that myth is exploded, a lot of the other ideas that underlie current federal policy, current relationships with the United States and with the states starts to unravel. I'm a lawyer. I've read all of the Supreme Court cases about Indians. This is not the history that is acknowledged in those cases. It's only the wandering nomad, the savage, the barbarian that is the underlying rationale for the laws that permitted the taking without compensation of Indian land over and over and over again. If it were ever admitted that Indians were capable of civilizations as advanced as Egypt, Rome, and Greece at similar times in history, the whole idea underlying the taking of the land, the legal justifications for the taking, begin to fall apart. So I can no longer read a Supreme Court decision that characterizes history in certain ways and without blanching, frankly. We even had a Supreme Court justice in 1955 long after educated people should have known better, who said, I can't get the quote exactly, and I couldn't find it on my BlackBerry today, but he said that every American schoolboy knows that the treaties between the tribes and the United States were not really treaties, were not really transactions, but rather they were, in essence, gifts from the United States. If it were not for the generosity of the United States, the Indians would have nothing at all. So it wasn't a bargain. It wasn't a respectable agreement between sovereigns. It was a gift from the United States to the Indians. Again, if that's your approach, if that's what you believe, then you can rule, as the court did in that case, that the Aboriginal title of Alaska Natives to the entirety of the state of Alaska could be taken without compensation. That's the consequences of not knowing this history. And so Justice Reed said every American schoolboy knows this to be the case. In this respect, it does not matter that what they know is wrong. Justice Reed is right to say every American schoolboy knows this, because that is exactly what they were taught, that's exactly what he was taught, and he brings that prejudice and that ignorance to his job as a justice of the United States Supreme Court and makes decisions affecting profoundly the rights of Native Americans. So this ignorance has real consequences to Native American interests to this day. Now, so what does that mean? What do we do now? The curators at the National Museum of the American Indian believe very strongly that the encounter and ultimate confrontation between Native America and Europeans is the most significant event in the recorded history of humans, not just of the Americas, but of the whole world. New products, new wealth, and yes, new ideas moved to and from Europe and the rest of the world and left all of the world forever changed. And this is the result of the contact between Native Americans and the rest of the world. If the indigenous nations of the Western Hemisphere are ever to be secure in their political, economic, and cultural rights, what is now the rather specialized knowledge of the few of us who take a deep interest in Native peoples must become general knowledge, known or at least readily available to all Americans, and then to all North Americans, Mesoamericans, and Latin Americans, and then all Europeans, Africans, and Asians. Only then will the myth of Native inferiority be finally defeated. So what does any of this have to do with museums? Well, oddly, ironically, perhaps bizarrely, our ancient adversaries for possession of our patrimony, our antagonists in the struggle for the right to define who we are, now represent, in my judgment, the most powerful platforms from which Native people may find their voice and tell their story. The new paradigm of the Indian Museum requires that Native people themselves be deeply involved in the presentation of Native culture, history, and art. Museums like the Gilcrease, like the Heard in Phoenix, the Southwest in Los Angeles, the Eiteljorg in Indianapolis, and of course the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington and New York, are committed to this joint work with Native nations. And through these institutions, the Native nations can speak to a broader audience than they can readily capture on their own. So the question becomes, how shall we use these platforms? We will discuss this with the tribes in coming years, but I'm quite certain that our role is to emphasize certain facts into the American mind. And so at the National Museum of the American Indian, we're thinking about a few very specific exhibitions that we want to do. One I refer to by shorthand as Apocalypse. The shock troops of the War for the Americas were microbes. In almost every case, by the time colonists arrived in any force to threaten Native communities, nations, and empires, The natives had been fatally weakened by disease before the European soldiers arrived. The current estimates suggest that there were as many people in the Americas as there were in Europe in 1492. Perhaps as many as 90% were killed by disease introduced by Europeans. This means tens of millions of people died in a matter of decades. The world that the colonists found then was truly post-apocalyptic, and it made all the difference in the world in the outcome of the confrontation. Another story that we want to tell is that of the great Mesoamerican and South American empires. We've chosen for now the Inca, and we have an exhibit in development called the Inca Road, or as they say down there, I'll try to say this right, the Capac Ñan. The Inca Road ran the entire length of the Andes, and down the mountainsides everywhere there was a community that was a part of the greater Inca Empire. Many parts of this road are still in use today. They literally still do not understand how the Incas managed to move these stones into position. Some of the joints in the public buildings are so perfect that even after several hundred years, there is no plant life that has grown between it. That's how fine the work was. It's an extraordinary feat of engineering, of construction, and yet very few of us know very much about it. And so at the museum, we're going to produce this show called the Inca Road to show just how elaborate this civilization was at the time of the arrival of Europeans. Next, we have a show in development on treaties. You know, diplomacy is as old as the Indian nations themselves. The native diplomats who engaged the United States were not bit players in American history. They were central characters. They negotiated effectively. They protected their nation's interest with intelligence and articulation, and they were well aware of the stakes of the confrontation in which they were engaged. Far from being hapless victims of a superior race, they were master diplomats. That the promises that were made to them were broken and that honor was betrayed doesn't diminish their accomplishment. When treaties were made and honored, Indians prospered. And when treaties were broken, Indians died. It really is as simple as that. And that's the story, another of the stories that we want to tell about American Indians. And finally, we're working on an exhibit on myth and culture. There's great controversy still in the Indian world over the Bering Straits. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a new study released by some, I guess they're called genealogists, who were studying the DNA of a number of different tribal communities in the U.S., in Latin America. And they believe they have established through their work with the DNA of the people of these various communities that there was a single migration of people from Asia that resulted in all of the Americas being populated. And some little reporter called me quite breathless, hoping that I would say something provocative about the Bering Straits. And he asked me, do you believe in Native American origin myths? And I said, oh, yes, I do. He said, so you believe them? I said, yes, I do. And he said, so then what about the Bering Straits? And I said, well, I believe that too. And he said, well, how can both of those be true? And I said, it only requires a little imagination to see that many of the origin myths of Native American cultures are clearly metaphors for migration, for great movement over long, long distances, and the encountering different kinds of climates and topographies and geographies and all of those things. And so, as I explained to this reporter, the Hopi did emerge from that high desert country in Arizona, because until they were there and populated those mesas, they were not Hopis. And yet, at the same time, surely they did come across the Bering Straits or in some other fashion come from Asia. So what we're going to try to show in an exhibit about mythology is that, first of all, mythology is universal. For example, almost all of the cultures of the Middle East and Europe have a flood myth very similar to the Noah myth. Well, it turns out a lot of tribes in the United States have flood myths as well, and they are strikingly similar, and they clearly predate the arrival of Europeans. The same, of course, with all of the origin myths. And what we're going to do is some comparative mythology and show just how widespread many of these themes are, not just in the mythology of Native Americans, but in world mythology in general, and show that, in fact, probably we all came from the same place at some point in time. But just not to be so afraid of science as being that threatening to native spiritual understandings. I certainly don't find it that way, and we want to help convince people that no one should be afraid of the Bering Straits. So, this is an exciting time. It's just been in the last 20 years that the relationship between universities and tribes, between museums and tribes, between the academy in general, science in general, scholars in general, has really begun to be redefined in very effective ways, where the tribes are full collaborators, full partners in the work that's being done that affects them. No longer are the tribes simply the subject of study by the outside expert. Rather, they are full participants in doing the research that they need to understand better how to solve the problems that they encounter. That's the appropriate role of the academy and of the museums in engaging with the tribes in this day and age. We're very, very lucky to have the kinds of institutions that are available to assist in carrying this information forward and putting it before the public and encouraging people to really understand just how phenomenally rich American history truly is. How so very clearly the world made America, and they made it on a foundation that was laid by Native America. No one gets all the credit for the good that's been done in and by this country, or for the bad that's been done in and by this country. And I think that makes this just a really exciting time for us to begin to make these breakthroughs, to really talk about what it's going to mean to be an American as we become an ever more diverse culture. It's just to me that it's incredibly exciting to be able to be a part of that, to get to think about it, write about it, talk about it, do exhibitions about it, and I hope we'll see you all at the museum sometime soon. So thank you for your attention. Thanks for coming tonight. I appreciate it.
Kevin, we have I haven't ever really uttered this since I've been chief. It's something I was writing about when I had the newspaper. And I was just wondering maybe you can speak to it. There's been a lot of discussion among certain academic circles about the U.S. Constitution and what influenced its formation. And, concepts that were clearly foreign to the Europeans, like women's rights or states' rights, things of that nature, seem to just bubble up into this U.S. Constitution. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that as part of your view of what possibly we can do to help educate ourselves in the larger information.
Yeah. We have the museum produced a poster with a wampum belt that signifies the great law of peace of the five nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, later 6, but then 5. And the tagline on it is the first draft of the Constitution. That's an exaggeration, frankly. The reality is that certainly the Americans were influenced I think, mostly by the simple freedom that Indian people had at that time. The lack of government control over people, true liberty, true freedom of speech, a true right to pick up and leave if you didn't want to stick around. And that was very attractive to people who had come from a different kind of political environment in Europe. I think it's probably going too far to say that that the Iroquois Confederacy really served as the model for the Constitution, because there was at least one important example of separation of powers in Europe at the time, and that was the English. And so it sort of stands to reason that was the primary influence. But the idea of personal liberty, the idea of not allowing governmental power to be concentrated, the wide dispersion of power in tribal confederacies may well have influenced the founders. Certainly, in at least some tribes, women fared much better than they did under early American law. Yes?
Vietnam Memorial is portable, and it goes around the country. Not the original that they had for 22. Are any of the programs that you've been putting together, are any of those going to be portable so that people who can't get to Washington or New York will be able to see?
Yes, some already are. We do have some traveling exhibits, but they're banner exhibits. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but sort of pull them up, and we have 16 banners that tell a story. So we have one on the native code talkers of World War I and World War II. We're working on another right now that'll be coming out this fall called Indivisible, and it's about people of mixed African and Native ancestry. And I think that's going to be a real good exhibit. We want to expand our traveling programs in general, but even more tellingly, we need to get much better at making material available on the internet. And so I think you'll see in the next couple of years some major upgrades to our website and a major increase in the availability of images and text and also video and sound on our website. So we do want to, we feel an absolute responsibility to reach into the communities with this material. Yes?
Speaking of the internet, your name has been mentioned in several places where discussion of Indian affairs comes up as a person who should be a potential candidate for Justice Souter's position on the Supreme Court. So I'm wondering, if this is too personal, please simply defer. I don't want to put you on the spot. Has anybody talked to you? Or would you take the position that we offer?
Nobody has talked to me. Nobody will talk to me. Nobody should talk to me about that job. That's a good reason not to trust what you see on the internet. That's just... You know, but it speaks to an important point, which is there are no Native American federal judges in the entire country, and that's absurd at this point in history. There are several thousand Native American attorneys. Surely there's one or two that deserve an appointment as a judge. I have a really good job, so I don't want to be a judge. But there are some very fine lawyers out there who really should be on the bench by now, and so. You're not going to see an Indian on the Supreme Court because none of us have been federal district judges or federal courts of appeal, federal court of appeals judges. But there are lawyers who are certainly qualified. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure how much time you've had a chance to look at the Gover's collection. I was curious for you what seems significant about the collection, what could be shared, people in a productive way.
You have I haven't seen much of the collection. Just didn't get around today, but I'll make another visit and get Dwayne to show me around. It does strike me that the collection here really marks the evolution of contemporary Native art, and which is something I didn't really talk about very much, but I feel very strongly about, is that Native American contemporary art is simply ignored, when in fact these are very, very fine artists. Their work should be taken seriously. It should be studied by scholars. It should be understood by the public at large. Your collection, the Gilcrease collection, really has the potential to show a fascinating evolution from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, which was when this kind of art emerged in media that are familiar to contemporary art connoisseurs. You probably have some wonderful archaeological materials for all I know, but I haven't seen it yet. So you have some Maria pots, so that's pretty impressive. Good ones too. Not that I was, covetous. Very good. Well, thank you so much. Very nice to be here.